My name is Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And the McFarland Center sponsors and supports a variety of lectures, conferences, special events on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. They support the college's mission statement in all of those ways. And also with a focus on our obligation to one another and our special responsibility to the world's poor and powerless, which is a theme that we will talk about today. You can learn more and find our lectures online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, including for people who can't be here today. You can tell your friends that they'll be able to see this shortly. I'm really happy tonight to be able to introduce our guest speaker, philosopher Olúfẹ Taiwo, Femi as he goes by, who will help us think more carefully about something we claim to prioritize here at our Jesuit school, the well-being of the most marginalized people in our society. And he helps us think how we're failing to center their voices, even when we claim to be. Professor Taiwo has earned a lot of attention recently for his public work in the areas of identity politics, reparations, and climate change. My interest was stoked by his interest in his focus on elite capture, about which he'll say more soon. His ideas aim not simply to question the state of identity politics or all politics today, but to bring us, as he says, to, quote, a more transformative, non-sectarian, and coalitional politics. Reviewers of his works have described him as a, quote, thinker on fire, quote, one of the great social theorists of our generation, end quote, and, quote, one of the country's most publicly prominent philosophers. He's published 2 books this year, the first in January, the first is Reconsidering Reparations, that's not this one, and the second one, which we'll talk about today, is Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. His articles have been featured in The New Yorker, New York Magazine, The Nation, Boston Review, Dissent, Al Jazeera, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, among other places. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University, where he teaches political and social philosophy, including courses on the philosophy of reparations and global justice and the environment. His theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, there's a trick that he's put those together well, and contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. He's published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, Philosophical Papers, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. Please join me in welcoming Femi Taiwo.
All right. Thanks to everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. What I'm going to talk to you about today is pretty much the central argument, or at least one of the main arguments in the book Elite Capture. And just say a little bit about why it is that I bothered to write this particular argument, which originally came out as a kind of, I assumed that only fellow nerds would read it. It came out in this online magazine called The Philosopher, which is just as it sounds, it appeals to philosophers or people who think about philosophy, but it ended up on Tumblr and all these other weird corners of the internet. So I guess it kind of struck a nerve. But the reason why I wrote this weird thing is because I was in organizing spaces with people trying to change things, people trying to get ICE out of LA, people trying to change the syllabi in our classrooms, people struggling for justice in one corner or that other corner of society. And I was a little frustrated at times with how these conversations were going. And we're going to hear in a second a little bit, at least what my perspective is on these. I'll try to speak quickly so I can hear yours. But all of this comes from me trying to think through what is it that I think we're getting right in these organizing spaces, in these conversations about what justice is, what are we getting wrong, and how can we do a better job. So, it's a little different in inspiration than some of the other stuff I work on in academic philosophy, where I'm just responding to stuff that's happening in books. So there you go. Hopefully by the end of this, we'll see in particular what it is that I think is going wrong in the way that identity politics works out in at least some spaces. That will be this term called deference. We'll get into what a better kind of focus or set of priorities might be. That will be this bit about construction. So just to zero in on what it is that I'm talking about here. In these organizing spaces, and not just in organizing spaces, on recruitment, videos and brochures for universities, and many a DEI presentation, you might hear phrases like these. As a black person, and then that person will proceed to give you a political opinion on something. Or as a person of color, they might say, a person who may themselves be a person of color or may position themselves as an ally to people of color or women or trans folks or non-gender conforming folks might say something like, we should center the voices of, and might talk about those various categories of people that I just listed. I take it we've heard these phrases before. So what's behind that? What might justify the kind of appeal that's being made when people talk in that way? And as a philosopher, there is a kind of philosophy, a kind of position on epistemology, which is just a fancy way of saying knowledge, what we think about knowledge, how we might think about who knows things, and when we're justified in knowing things. All that study is epistemology. And there's a kind of epistemology that people have done that connects powerfully to the kinds of statements that were on the previous slide. In particular, a way of thinking about epistemology called standpoint theory. It was originally kind of pioneered by a Hungarian Marxist, György Lukács. It's been taken up by lots of people afterwards, especially feminist philosophers. And if you ask people what standpoint epistemology is, what this way of thinking about knowledge is, they'll tell you that it revolves around some pretty simple claims, and I think pretty innocuous claims, and I think pretty accurate claims. So let's go through them one by one. Knowledge is socially situated, number one. Where you are in the world affects what it is you know. For example, I'm willing to bet that there's things that each of you know about the College of the Holy Cross that I do not. Why? Because you go here, you spend time here, you have access to information about what this campus is like that I don't have because I live in Washington, D.C., which is very far away, so on and so forth. Right? So I give you a simple, non-politically charged, common sense kind of example like that, and you can see the flavor of what it is people are trying to say. Number two, marginalized groups are socially situated in ways that make it more possible for them to be aware of things and ask questions than it is for the non-marginalized. Now you start to see why Tucker Carlson might get mad, right? Because now we're not talking about innocuous things like who knows, what the cool places to eat are around Holy Cross. But now we're talking about which kinds of people might know things that are politically important about the structure of the society that we're in. In particular, people who are marginalized, for example, people who aren't men in a society structured by patriarchy, for instance, might know things about society that other people don't know. Like what it is like to fear certain kinds of male violence might be the sort of thing that people who aren't men would know more of or have a different kind of access to than people who are. Okay? So that's number 2. And number 3 is, I think, the most straightforward of the 3, which is just, if 1 and 2 are true, we should use them. Right? If we're doing research, if we're doing political organizing, if we're trying to change the world, or even simply just trying to understand the world, it should take into account who knows what. So if knowledge is socially situated, and we're looking for knowledge about the Holy Cross, maybe we should go to the Holy Cross and ask people, you know, where do you eat around here? What's the campus like in the winter? That's where in the world you should go if you're trying to answer the research question, what is this college like? And similarly, if you're trying to answer the question, what is the patriarchy like? What is it like to exist in this kind of system of domination? You might look at number 2 and ask the kind of people who would have a certain kind of insight, a perhaps special kind of insight into the answer to that question. Number 3 is just, we should use numbers 1 and 2. Again, I've suggested to you that not only are these things true, I think they're actually kind of obviously true and obviously unproblematic in and of themselves. And if you'd like, I'm a philosopher, you could read this thought experiment that a colleague of mine put together. Or we could just use the example of what this particular campus is like. I'm not going to read this slide. I'm going to leave it up long enough that you can read it. But what this is designed, what this little thought experiment is designed to say is just that it is obvious to us, it is an ordinary aspect of how it is that we figure out who knows what, that we acknowledge that knowledge is socially situated, and that the kinds of differences that being marginalized makes to society in the way that the kinds of differences that perhaps residential segregation, the kinds of differences that job discrimination might make to who is where in society, those are the things that are tied up with marginalization. Is obvious and ordinary to think that those might have something to do with who knows what. So, if the problem isn't with the central contentions, these 3 kind of innocent-seeming contentions about who knows what in society, what is the problem? So I thought about the kinds of spaces that I was in, and the kinds of arguments I was hearing, and the kinds of contentions people were making. And I got a little nervous because of this juxtaposition right here. So on the left, you see things that I often hear people who embrace some kind of identity politics, broadly construed, like saying we should center the most marginalized, we should listen to the most effective, we should believe X, Y, or Z, where X, Y, and Z are kinds of people. We should believe black people, we should believe women, et cetera, et cetera. All things that seem to be onto something. But here are things I don't see in academic spaces, or at least not quite as often. I do not often find people who live in slum conditions, though unfortunately that is very present in the world in general. The sorts of people who are doing this have access to reliable drinking water more often than not. Depends on where in the US you are, fortunately, but seems broadly true. The kinds of devastation being experienced in Pakistan right now, not happening over here. Well, that's only a matter of time. But the sorts of people doing the theory are disproportionately on the safe side of global material conditions. How it is that people get food, water, energy, shelter. So the problem isn't the basic idea. The problem isn't the three innocuous contentions. But maybe, I'm suggesting, there is a problem. Right, so if it isn't the innocuous contentions about who knows what might the problem be? How I've been talking about it is using this term in the room. And I use the term in the room because I'm hoping it is not too obscure or hard to understand. We all know what rooms are. We're in one right now, right? But I just mean spaces where we interact. There could be a Zoom room. God knows there could be Zoom rooms these days. Too many of them. But we interact. And we don't interact with everybody on the planet. We interact with particular people on the planet. I'm not talking to everyone who exists. I'm talking to you all who are in this room with me right now. And a condition of you all being in this room with me right now is the admissions process at the College of the Holy Cross. And the condition of you getting across that admissions process was good enough performance in GPA and standardized tests and so on and so forth. And the condition of that was explained by, what it is that your life was like when you were taking those tests and earning those grades, et cetera, et cetera. So, if we look around at who it is that we're in a position to interact with, what kind of people we're in a position to interact with, we're starting to home in on what it is that might be wrong with the particular kinds of ways of talking about identity politics that I've picked out. I'm going to go back for a second to this slide. And all I want to point out is that this contention, number 3, tells us that we should take into account how knowledge is socially situated. And it tells us that we should take into account the fact that being socially marginalized has something to do with who knows what. What it doesn't tell us is how to take this into account. For that, we need something else. We need practical norms. We need ideas about what it is that we should do about the fact that knowledge is socially situated, that certain people have access, or easier access, perhaps we should say, to certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of facts, certain kinds of ways of understanding the world. So these norms that we use to put standpoint epistemology into practice, to go from this abstract idea that knowledge is socially situated to actually interacting differently in rooms with each other, those norms and the concepts that we use to understand those norms are where we need to find our answers. As I was just explaining, by reference to the admissions priorities and guidelines of the college we're at, for example, is pointing out one of the first things here, which is that the aspects of our social structure determine which interactions we have, who we interact with, and that might actually be more important to figuring out what we should do about the world than how we choose to interact in these rooms. The way that I talk to you might be less important than the kinds of things that explain why we're having a conversation at all, which is the fact that you all did well enough in high school to access a place like this, and I did well enough in high school and grad school to have a fancy job and get an invite to talk to you all. It's important that we think about this because some rooms have outsized power and influence. I'm not the only person in this room with a fancy job. You all God willing, will go on to have, you know, fancy jobs and get to talk to exciting people and so on and so forth. You know, you all might be in a position to change things. Not everything, but some things. And so it matters how you all decide to wield that power that you will have. So finally, all that set up, here's what I'm criticizing. You could think that what is important about rooms like this is how we interact in them. So which one of us is sitting quietly while somebody wheels through slides and talks about them, and which of us, literally in this case, has the microphone. You might think that is the thing that determines whether or not we're making a good kind of change in the world. And so we might look at a room like this and say, well, if we want to improve justice, this guy ranting with the mic should just hand it to a different person in the room who's perhaps better situated. And maybe I should, you know. But there's another kind of target that we could have, and that's what I'm calling the constructive epistemology. And the epistemology isn't super important. The constructive part is the part that really matters. But what if we were less focused on how we're talking in this room, or what if we were more focused on what our talking in this room accomplishes? And I mean this in real material terms. You might think that we could get together in a room like this and talk about who should get evicted and whether anybody should get evicted, and then plan out what we're going to do to make sure that nobody gets evicted. Or we could get into this room and talk about what the levels of water quality should be, and plan out how we're going to test the water to see if they meet those criteria, and what we're going to do if they don't. How we're going to make the lives of the water regulators hell if they don't make sure the water's clean. That's another thing that we could do in this room. And whether or not we do that doesn't come down to who has the mic. It comes down to what we're doing in this room. So that is the basic contours of the argument. I'm going to wheel quickly through a slightly more complicated version of the argument. But what I really want to get to, and what I really want to say a little bit about before I hand the mic over to you all, is what we should do instead. So why is it that paying attention to who is centered, who's treated as, who the mic is passed to, who's given the lion's share of attention, why is that so wrong of an approach? Why does that rub Femi the wrong way? Those of us who are committed to social justice, somehow, some way, some form, think that there's something wrong with the world. Perhaps even multiple things wrong with the world. Well, one of the things about the world that we want to change is that it serves as a filtering mechanism, or aspects of how the world is put together serve as filtering mechanisms. And I like to use myself as an example, just so people don't think that I'm saying this as an attack on other people. So I'll tell you the story of why I'm here and why I have this microphone. And one place we could start it, if we're historically minded, is we could start the story in the 20th century. And the reason we might start it there is because immigration laws were less than friendly to Africans, which I am. And it took substantial legislative reforms to make a pathway to legal immigration possible for people like myself. And the reason that happened had a little bit to do with something called the Cold War and the wave of anti-colonial revolutions, all things which your teachers here can tell you much about, There's lots to say about them. But for now, let's just focus on the fact that these legal reforms did in fact happen in 1965. And they made it possible for someone with ancestry like mine to end up over here. But they didn't make it likely, necessarily. The kinds of immigration that were safer bets for people with ancestry like mine were the kinds of immigrations that would provide the US with skilled labor. So lo and behold, the kinds of people who end up here from Nigeria, which is where my family is from, are disproportionately skilled professionals, like my parents were. In fact, extremely disproportionately skilled professionals. Nigerian American community, quiet as it's kept, one of the most educated and successful immigration populations in the United States. That doesn't just explain the fact that my parents got over here, but it explains many of the class advantages that I had growing up, and the good education and the expectations of higher education that I grew up with, which explained why my parents were very insistent that I go to advanced placement classes and honors classes, and then a good undergraduate institution, and then higher education, and so on and so forth. And now I teach at a very fancy school. And that is a story of how I am the person, as opposed to the millions of Nigerians who live on $1 a day, in this room with you, wearing this TED Talk microphone, walking around like a crazy person. Now, what is the point? The point is, this room and my place in it, just like your place in it, is at the end of a long causal chain, or I should say long causal chains, long sequences of cause and effect that explain why it is that we're interacting at all. And so, if we're trying to change the world that consists of those chains of cause and effect, and we do so by starting at the end of them and then saying, those of us who have been chosen by this unfair, suboptimal system should pass the mic around differently amongst us than we otherwise would, I think we're missing a lot of opportunities to make the world better. I think we're missing the bulk of what is, in fact, wrong with the world. I think we're steering into the thing that is the title of my book. So that's elite capture. That's when group resources or projects or social movements end up reshaping themselves around the goals, aspirations, and intentions of the most advantaged members of those groups. Right? So if the thing we're supposed to solve by deference, by passing the mic, is to get a better sense of what it is like for people who are marginalized, I think this is a poor way to do it for the exact same reason that learning about the way the global system is disproportionately harmful to the kinds of people that grow up in Nigeria would be a research goal that would be poorly served by handing me the microphone, because it is precisely the senses, is precisely the facts about my life that are different from the vast majority of Nigerian people that explain why I'm in this room with you, to talk about that, that set of experiences. So if we want a strategy for understanding why the world is bad for people, I don't think deference is a good one. This is me being a jerk. I'm not even gonna read this slide. I don't know why I still have it. All right. Let's skip to here. what should we do instead? Where this comes from is a good motivation, right? We want to understand the world. We want to acknowledge the fact that the world isn't fair for everyone while we try to understand the world. And it is true that I experience racism. It's just true. It's just true that the people here who aren't men experience patriarchy, and the people that are men experience patriarchy. We aren't getting everything wrong when we say we should be careful about how we interact with each other, even in fancy rooms, right? That's not unrelated to the topic of achieving justice more generally. But if we want to achieve justice more generally, there are so many more things that we need to do other than get things right between ourselves in these fancy lecture halls. So, what do we do? I'll remind you the difference between what I'm calling deference epistemology and the thing that I think is the good thing or the thing that I prefer, which is a question of priorities. It's not that we stop caring at all how we talk to each other, but what we focus on is this kind of thing. And that kind of thing becomes the answer to how we talk to each other. How do we stop the evictions? How do we make sure there's clean water if we're in Flint or in Jackson, Mississippi? How do we make sure that workers have better wages and working conditions? If those are the conversations we're having in the room, of course there are still questions about how we show respect and who gets to dominate those conversations, but our focus should be on having those kinds of interactions in a way that actually changes the world around us, because it is the structure of the world around us that explains the injustices that we're trying to fight. Okay, what does that mean though? As I've been alluding to, I keep giving this example of Flint, Michigan. I'm going to talk through it at a little more length just so that's more obvious what I'm trying to say. So if you don't know about the Flint water crisis, here's the basics of it. Michigan Department of Environmental Quality switched the water source that went to the faucets of the people of Flint in 2014. Everybody immediately knew that something went horribly wrong. The water was brown. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, General Motors, they all stopped using this water immediately, even as they claimed publicly that the water was fine. Okay, so standard corruption story. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality claims that the water is safe to drink, helped along by a series of unelected officials, some of whom were black, like many of the residents of Flint, Michigan, including the President of the United States, who pretended to drink Flint water. And again, what I'm trying to say here is not a solution celebrating particular people or having a conversation that just explains what it feels like to be poisoned. What is the solution? Getting rid of the poison. And that is, of course, what the residents of Flint organized themselves around. The room that they built, I'm sure, had, all sorts of problems, as all rooms do, in terms of who was taking up space and who was listening to whom. But they got the necessary things right. What were the necessary things? Well, what do we need to figure out and be able to prove in this room? They got their neighbors together and mounted a citizen science campaign to test the water levels. They recruited scientists to check and prove that there was lead and Legionnaire's disease in the water at Virginia Tech and at the a local children's hospital and prove that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was lying. They recruited lawyers and talked to them and got them to sue the government into changing the pipes and paying some damages. They got everybody else to talk about it to help bring in more resources for doing all of that. And that is how they saved themselves. It was not an epistemic battle at all. It wasn't a battle about whether or not the water was poisoned or who even knew the water was poisoned. It was a battle of people with power doing something that worked for them, and people without power needing to build some to hold them to account. And last year, I believe, actually, this was 2 years ago, but they won a payout and won forcing the government to continue replacing the problematic lines. So that is not a total victory. There's still the fallout from the poison. There's still the fact that lawyers' fees are going to cut into the payout. But it is progress towards victory. And the kinds of things that are focused on in deference epistemology are not. That is the claim that I'm making. So I'm going to read this one last slide, because I think this is really the crux of it. I started off this presentation by waving around words like epistemology and talking about theories of knowledge and research projects to get at deep problems in the world. And I suggested to you that these had something to do with the political problems that we have. And they do. I didn't lie. But I do think it is a little bit misleading, which is why I like the Flint example. I do think it's a bit misleading to pretend as though the problems that we have with the world are really at bottom problems of knowledge. I think the people who make the world like it is know exactly what they're doing. I think most of the rest of us know what they're doing, right? I don't think it's actually about whether or not we believe the Flint residents in a purely belief sense of the word believe. I think it's about what we do about those beliefs. I don't think the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality believed the water was fine. I believe they said so because it was better for them. And they had the power to act as if the water was clean. And that is something that is in the wheelhouse of very traditional politics. You know, there's those with power who set rules and those without power who have to follow them or build the power to resist. So if you have that perspective on knowledge, that's ultimately about action, all the things that we're talking about, then the threats to justice from a knowledge perspective aren't really about who it is that we believe and who we don't believe, or which spokespeople from which marginalized groups that we give attention to or withhold attention from. I think it's about these things. I think the corporate monopolization of local news, I think the destruction and the looting of the profession of journalism, I think the interference of corporations and governments in democratic processes, I think the domination of elite interests in the production of knowledge, the kinds of things that we do in rooms like this, in ways that are very skewed to the fanciest universities and think tanks, I think those are the problems for the politics of knowledge. And those are the things that we would have to change fundamentally if we wanted the world to produce knowledge in a better way that was better for marginalized people. And if we wanted to do that, we would need new forms of making news, or at least to defend the ones that we have. We would need new ways of running universities and or to defend the ones that we have. We would need new education systems in general. We would need new research systems in general. And those are the changes we should make if we really want to know things, and if we want to know things in a way that is compatible with justice. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for a thought-provoking talk. Could you comment on how this idea of constructive epistemology might apply to an educational institution where the primary goal of the institution is to develop students and to have them use the education as a way to modify their own life trajectory, right? If that's the primary mission of an institution, how does constructive epistemology apply?
Thanks. That's a really important question. I think especially for us, given, all of us are involved some way or other with the university. The basic thing that I think is that shouldn't be the goal of universities. And so the practical question is, what do we do to make, to get a more civically minded goal, actually explain how it is that universities operate? And we're not quite as far from that, I think, as it might seem, especially after 40 or 50 years of neoliberalism. If you haven't heard that term, I ask my teachers about it, but after 40 or 50 years of a trajectory in global politics where more and more things are privatized, and fewer things are run for the public good than there used to be. But I went to grad school in UCLA. And the University of California higher education system used to be on what was called the master plan. And that was a plan that integrated the university, the UCs, UC Berkeley and UCLA, the University of California, another system called the Cal States, Cal State Dominguez Hills, et cetera, and community colleges. And the goal of this whole plan was to make sure that everybody could access higher education. And with this plan, of course, was funding commensurate with what that would require. So, even in this imperfect world, there was a whole structure built to make sure that everybody could access higher education. And perhaps as a result of that, higher education worked a little bit differently then, in the 60s and 70s. You had rowdy people ending up at these California institutions. People that started to protest against the Vietnam War, people who started to protest against structural racism. And after that, for some reason, interest in the master plan declined a little bit, and funding for the master plan declined a little bit. And now you have these very exclusive, still public, but very selective, especially on the admission side, universities. So I say all that to say that it is not like some pie-in-the-sky dream to think that what higher education should be for should and could and has been for general public uplift. It is a thing that, in fact, happened in California and elsewhere, and happens elsewhere. But you need to win some structural changes to make that possible. One is what I already mentioned, levels of funding that are commensurate with that goal of the university. That's the kind of funding that you have to have if you want the people that provide education to have reasonable working conditions, as opposed to an education system where the people providing education are underpaid and undersecured, like graduate workers and adjunct workers. Right now in the UC system, there's one of the largest strikes that there's been in US history about exactly this. But you also need, I think, to change how it is that we evaluate the research and the academic work that happens in these institutions. I know that I got my degree by convincing 5 people, precisely 5 people, that I had said something worth saying. And don't get me wrong, I think flexibility and a sort of freedom from surveillance are important academic values, and we shouldn't just produce for mass consumption. But I do think that, I've spent my entire academic career answering whatever questions I felt like answering. And I think it could be that at least some of the research questions that are answered in universities are explicitly research questions that come from the communities around those universities. I don't think the people who work at UCLA are the only people that have questions about philosophy or soil science or public health. And so they shouldn't be the only people that those resources get used. They shouldn't be the only people whose research questions get answered in those spaces. The other people that live in LA County, the other people that live in the world should have some level of say in what happens in these departments. And so some of these things that need to change, like funding, are big things that need to challenge governments, but some of them are small things that need to challenge how departments work. But the more we make all of those scale of changes, I think the more possible it is to have a genuinely public education.
Girls get shyer with the mic up. But I know there's some non-shy people here besides us.
Thank you for that stimulating lecture. I'm curious about sort of thinking about these elite rooms and how do we break them up, right, and create these new rooms. Could you talk a little bit about how you see subversion as working in this sort of constructive epistemology, and how you see sort of, again, I'm thinking of the university, sort of, some people have suggested Robin Hooding universities and taking resources and redistributing it. So could you comment on kind of where you see that standing in your idea of constructive epistemology? Obviously, it would be nice if everyone just agreed, hey, let's be constructive and do good things, but given, as you've stated here, elite kind of dominance of the purse strings, of media, of all that stuff, what other ways do you kind of advise us to do that?
Robin Hooding, huh? You're not a cop, are you? Here's what I'll say. I'll say 2 things, actually. So the first thing is, I think there are a lot of ways that are totally in bounds by the rules of the university as the universities themselves spell them out, to move resources from the campus to other parts of the world, other parts of the surrounding city. This is a way that the public health grant structures, for example, are totally fine with. There are certainly ways to move resources that might involve thinking a little creatively, and most importantly, might involve, prioritizing something besides what the university has told you to prioritize, but that needn't involve breaking any sorts of policies, or even, or even really bending them. What these kinds of research structures, no, I'll stop that there. The second thing I wanted to say is, I think at bottom, the thing that I find so strange is that we would even have to be subversive about it. So one of the things I didn't mention about the Flint case, but that really bugs me about it, is that the research lab that did the analysis of the Flint water was in Virginia. And, I mean, I was kind of like, why do we even have labs in Michigan if y'all aren't going to test the water in Michigan? Like, what are you doing? The thing at bottom that I hope we can change, that I hope we can change, is the basic fact about the university, not the universe, I guess both, but the basic fact about the university that would make it stealing for it to serve the people that universities are housed around. Like, what I think is stealing is what the universities are now. A few hundred hedge funds with classrooms attached. Like, that's not what I signed up for myself. But here's where I find myself, and here's where all of my colleagues find ourselves. And that's the thing that's the theft. If we want to talk about theft. And last thing I'll say, a lot of these universities, especially the bigger ones like the one I'm at, super villains. Like, the endowments of these universities are funding, like, deforestation in Brazil. They're huge landowners. Somebody told me the proportion of Philadelphia that was owned by the University of Pennsylvania the other day, and I fainted on the spot. Right? So yeah, that's the theft. I'm stepping off my soapbox now. Thank you.
Hi. Does this work? Okay. Thanks for a great talk. So my question is, obviously these construction projects would have to start with people recognizing the issues with their current rooms. The problem is we obviously know people like their rooms, and part of the reason they like them is because they feel meritocratic to them from where they're often sitting. They feel like they have done the things that they need to do to get there. They deserve to be there, so why should they be giving something up? So I was wondering what your thoughts are on the role of education, and in some cases right now the backtracking on teaching the things that would make these more apparent, and what we can do about those things.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, it's kind of a, how do we get going? How do we get started constructing if many people don't want to construct, if many people have a kind of self-interested relationship to the university or whatever kinds of spaces we're imagining. I think one of the things that I don't think we need is a kind of altruistic, philanthropic, charity mindset. Right? And I'm not against any of those things. Like, it's good to help other people. It'd be weird if I were against that. But one of the ways that I think the basic thing that people are missing isn't actually, a political regard for other people in the charity kind of way, but actually the understanding that there's something in it for you if you change the university, right? There's something in it for you if you challenge these power structures. It's not something that you do as an ally for other people. It's something that you do for yourself with other people. The Flint example is, I think, just helpful in getting the thought going because, of course, everybody has the same water supply, right? The pipes are polluting everybody's water, and so there's something in it for everybody if we change the pipes. But the question, I think how we move that kind of thought to other less tidy political scenarios is we start with the forms of politics and the forms of association that are most like the Flint kind of example. This is a long wind-up for me saying, here's why I like unions. Here's what's good about unions, right? It's not that after we form a union, I become some enlightened, altruistic person, and I, for the first time realize that it's important for this coworker of mine to get treated well, where I didn't realize that before. That's not the thing that happens after you form a union. The thing that happens after you form a union is that it literally becomes true that her working conditions and my working conditions are linked. It literally becomes true that the thing I need to do to protect myself is the thing that I need to do to protect my coworker. And that is just what it means to bargain collectively. We win or lose this contract together. And I think once you get started actually doing that, actually having political relationships where that is obviously true, then I think people are more open to, thinking about more complicated political relationships that might not have an obvious, Flint or union level connection, but might have a more complicated, we all live in the same ecology kind of connection. Wouldn't it be nice to have a functional planet kind of connection? And then maybe bigger things are possible politically.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I have a question about the phrase safe space. So your use of the word room, it could be a literal room, but of course it could be a metaphor as well. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the notion of the safe space, which of course began as an idea based on the basic human need of marginalized persons to have that protection. But then over time became sort of co-opted, perhaps bastardized in some way. And so now what it means is that there are some spaces that are safer for some people and not so safe for other people. So in connection to kind of the work that you're doing with construction, what are your thoughts on the notion of a safe space? Safe and safer or not safe space?
Thanks for that question. I don't find myself using the phrase safe space or safer space, but I'm actually very sympathetic to the basic idea. And the fact that I'm sympathetic to the basic idea is part of why I wrote the book and part of why I made the particular criticism that I made. So I didn't talk much about the rest of what's going on in the book in this talk, but basically I try to say, elite capture is bad, it's happening with identity politics, but by the way, it's happening with everything else. And the reason I argue that it's not particular to identity politics is because I think identity politics is good. I think we should keep identity politics around. And this question about safe spaces is exactly the thing that I think is good about it. I think it's just true in the messy, imperfect world, as we find it, that some people are going to be more comfortable organizing around and with people who are like them in important ways than not. And we could have a couple kinds of reactions to that. We could say, you should get over it because, what is really needed is the inevitable onward march of the global working class informed by the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism. That's one kind of thing you could think. I happen not to think that. I think that, I think people can get started trying to change the world around and with the help of whoever they're confident doing that with. And changing the entire system might just be a result of having enough kinds of networks of people trying to change whatever it is that pisses them off. And that to me is just as plausible a story of change in a world as huge and complicated and messy as this one is. In fact, it's a more plausible story of change at scale than most of the other ones on offer. And so I think what's going on with safe spaces is just that, look, we should take seriously the fact that some people are comfortable around some other people, and we should encourage people to find the people that they're comfortable with, rather than staying out of politics in general, or staying out of sociality in general. It seems like you have a follow-up, but maybe you're just thinking. Yeah.
We'll go that way, I think.
Ah. Cool.
Maybe I'll just ask one last question. You gave the UC Berkeley answer, and I know I'm not on the mic, so I'll try and speak loud. But so we're a highly selective private institution, and we are elite in some sense. And so how do we think about eliteness? I mean, I know it's mixed in, but I want to maybe think a little bit more about mixed in what you're talking about. I look at it in a world where kids want to go to a highly selective place, we're driven for neoliberal reasons and otherwise even more in that direction. How do we think as a private institution about answering some of these when we are dependent on those markets, on the size of our endowment, on kids who individually want to get somewhere in the world? What answers do you have for us or for Georgetown outside of what the UC system can do?
Yeah. So I definitely agree that the basic setup of the problem is different at public institutions that are already supposed to be aligned with the public good, as opposed to private institutions which don't necessarily have that mandate built into what they are. But I still think it is possible, maybe not at the level of scale of the whole institution, but I think it's certainly possible at the level of scale of departments within the institution to take it upon themselves to ask, what is the version of history or chemistry or medical science or whatever the field might be, was the version of doing that here in Worcester that doesn't privatize all of the benefits of that exercise for just the people who are employed here and the people who study here. Maybe the sharing of benefits, maybe the senses in which those could be publicly focused and produce research that's usable for other people and include other people around in the education process. Maybe the proportion of that we would ask of a private institution would be smaller than we would ask from UC Berkeley or UCLA. But I still think we could ask that same basic question. How is it that we could make the benefits of the existence of this institution less private than the institution itself is? I think that's still a question worth asking. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.